All right. Welcome, everyone. This is Mr. Baxley. I am doing this lecture over the social changes in the United States from the 1960s and the 1970s for the Como-Pickton U.S. History classes and NTCC Dual Credit class with Como-Pickton. So, before we get started, this episode is a little edgy, okay? So, if you're ready, it's going to get a little wild. It's going to talk about some stuff that I don't know, maybe this will get demonetized. There's no money making off of this. But anyways, we'll see how this goes. All right, so last week we talked about the politics of the 1960s and 70s. And in the last couple of videos, I've put out some stuff about the big war in the 1960s, which was the Vietnam War. And we talked about the Civil Rights Movement, and that largely occurred during the 60s. What we're going to talk about now is kind of the rest of the cultural movements in the 60s and 70s. And you might be thinking to yourself, man, we've been talking about the 60s and 70s for a while. And that's important. In many ways, the 1960s is a turning point decade for the United States. Okay? A lot of changes happen in the 1960s that changed the course of American history when it comes to the idea of fighting for equality. There's a lot of movements in the 1960s outside of just the civil rights movement that fought for equality. When you talk about the role of government, the role of the United States government changes dramatically in the 1960s with the Great Society. When you talk about ideas like the growth of the federal government's power, when you talk about the growth of the United States as a world power, the 1960s sees the Vietnam War and kind of the United States running into a situation that we can't handle. So there's a lot of pivotal moments in the 1960s, and there's a reason why we're talking about them here. And this is a very liberal decade. You see a lot of changes in society that are more liberal in the 1960s and 1970s. So let's start off with feminism, okay? The modern version of the feminist movement gets its start in 1963 when a woman named Betty Friedan publishes a book called The Feminine Mystique. Now, feminism has existed before the 1960s, and if you study feminism, there are waves of feminism that go through the United States and the rest of the world, okay? A big wave of feminism is the wave that leads to the passage of the suffrage amendment, the 19th Amendment back in 1920. But after suffrage, the women's movement kind of loses its steam that it had leading up to the suffrage amendment. After the 19th Amendment is passed, there is less of that organized political movement for greater equality for women in American society. And things kind of go a little stagnant for a while. And you saw in the 1950s, the dominant culture of the United States really focused on these separate spheres and separate roles for men and women in society. Specifically, the woman staying home and being the homemaker, the mother, and the wife. In 1963, Betty Friedan challenged that idea with her book, The Feminine Mystique, and she said that women needed to have a better role in society. They needed to have a more involved role in society, and they needed to have, the same rights and privileges and expectations on them that men have, okay? Technically, men and women have the same legal rights. With the 19th Amendment, women have the right to vote. They have all these legal rights, but there's so much in society that's outside of the law that keeps women in this role as a wife, mother, homemaker. And so Betty Friedan wants to push out of that role, and she wants women to push out of that role and break those societal expectations. This book becomes really popular, and it starts a new wave of feminism. In 1966, Betty Friedan forms the National Organization for Women, or NOW. Their big goal is demanding equal pay for men and women, and they want to end gender discrimination. To put it simply, women did not get hired for the same jobs that men did. Women had less pay, often for the exact same job as men did, and there's a lot of discrimination that leads to women being put behind men economically. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not just end discrimination based off of race in public facilities. It also contained provisions that outlawed gender discrimination in employment. And so if you could prove that someone had discriminated upon you based off of your gender or your sex, then you could get in trouble, okay? Or the person who discriminated could get in trouble. And all of a sudden, people start talking about the idea of sexism, kind of like racism, but instead of judging someone based off of the color of the skin, you judge someone based off of their sex. Women start to adopt the title of Miss rather than Mrs. or MISS to define their identity separate from a relationship with a man. And women try to solve problems such as, back in the 1960s, having less than 40% of college enrollment, only 19 women in Congress, and a 59-cent wage gap. What that means is for about every dollar that a man made, women made about 59 cents. Now, this was due in part to just straight up some people paying women less than they would pay men for the same work, but it also was due to the fact that women were often passed off for promotions and that women were not given the same high-paying jobs that men would get. You know, simply put, there was less women in college. There was more societal expectations that women should stay home and be mom or be wife. And so they did not have the same opportunities to be financially, financially successful as men. Okay, and the idea was society expected women to be dependent upon a man to provide for them. But the feminist movement doesn't want that. The feminist movement wants women to be treated equally to men and to have the same equal portion of society. Okay? Betty Friedan said, a girl should not expect special privileges because of her sex, but neither should she adjust to prejudice and discrimination. And a lot of this has to do with reproductive rights, okay? So the 1960s sees some innovations that lead to changes in the way that people live, okay? And to put it bluntly, there is a double standard when it comes to men and women in sexual relationships. The worst thing that's going to happen to a man is get an STD. But for a woman, she can then get pregnant. And so that is part of, the reason why you have this division between the roles of men and women in American society is that women get pregnant, okay? And this can interrupt a woman's career path, having to stop her projection, her upward trajectory, especially when you're in your 20s and you're first starting out your job and you're first starting out your career and you're trying to get through college and get a nice paying job. If you stop and take a break in the middle of that to have a kid, it can interrupt the rest of your career and contribute to that wage gap. Okay, so many women wanted contraceptives, but in many places, contraceptives were illegal. In fact, back in the 19-teens, it was illegal even to talk about contraceptives. Margaret Sanger was a reproductive rights advocate, and she advocated for abortion and a lot of contraceptives, and she ended up getting arrested for talking about it. In 1960, the birth control pill was invented, and this was a big change because this was something that a woman could be in control of her own body's reproductive cycle rather than other contraceptives which relied on the man. And so the birth control pill was bitterly opposed by the Roman Catholic Church, and it was outlawed in many states across the United States. These laws were challenged in the Supreme Court by a married couple in the Supreme Court case called Griswold versus Connecticut in 1965. In this Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court found the laws that made birth control illegal were unconstitutional. How did the Supreme Court do that? The Supreme Court found a right of privacy, or right to privacy in the Constitution. Now, go look through your copy of the Constitution and you will not find the words, you have a right to privacy. This is a hidden right or a implied right, okay? The 9th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution says that the list of rights in the Constitution is not complete, that there are other rights that people have that might not have been written down in the Constitution. And there are other rights in the Constitution, like your 4th Amendment rights to be protected from illegal searches and seizures by the police, and other rights like the right to protect yourself from self-incrimination, things like that, that show that you do have a right to privacy. And so what happens in the privacy of your own home or within your own body is supposed to be private, and the government is not supposed to regulate that. according to the Supreme Court in Griswold versus Connecticut. So this said that contraceptives were constitutional and that laws prohibiting contraceptives were unconstitutional. So now, birth control is legal across the United States. Birth control pills. So women are able to take these pills and they can separate the act of sex with having a child. And this leads to a revolution in the country. All of a sudden, the rates of people getting married decreases and the rates of people cohabiting increase. Instead of getting married, people just live together, okay? And all of a sudden, entertainment becomes more openly sexual. You start to see more R-rated and X-rated films and television, and you start to see the country loosen up its morals in that area of life. This leads to a lot of other problems as well. It leads to increased rates of divorce. It leads to increased rates of STDs, and it paves the way for abortion to become more common. Because even though contraceptives are effective, they don't always work, okay? And the more open society led to more unwanted pregnancies. And this led to a lot of babies being killed. Feminist groups start working to remove laws that had banned abortions in the United States, and the Supreme Court used the same logic that they had in Griswold versus Connecticut to say in 1973 Roe versus Wade that abortion was legal. This is highly controversial, especially in the early days of abortion being legal. There's a lot of really scary abortions that happen that are very late term. There's partial birth abortions that happen in the United States. And many states work to regulate abortions and to try to eliminate them, even though the Supreme Court says they're okay. This leads to a divide in our country that still exists to this day, where people continue to argue over whether or not abortion should be legal. The two different sides are the pro-choice and the pro-life side. The pro-choice side goes along with the Supreme Court and says that a woman has the right to choose what happens to her body. The pro-life side says that that baby within the mother's body is a human being and it deserves the right to live. And it deserves that right to live, and a woman's choice of her body does not count because that body within her body is a human being. And so the debate really becomes over whether or not a fetus is a baby, or whether or not a baby is just a clump of cells, okay? To the pro-choice side, this fetus is not a human being. To the pro-life side, it is, and it has rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and abortion takes that away. I think you can probably figure out my personal opinion, but we'll say that a lot of people are not here that would have been here otherwise had not been for this. Anywho, Margaret Sanger, she was one of the early advocates for birth control and abortion. We still have debates over abortion today, and it still is a major issue in the United States. Now, the feminist movement's major goal was an amendment to the Constitution called the Equal Rights Amendment. This is what they wanted. Equality of rights under the law shall not be abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. This Equal Rights Amendment was first proposed in 1923, but it became popular in the late 1960s and 1970s. So this is an old idea. Right after 1920 is the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote. They immediately said, hey, let's make sure that women cannot be discriminated against, and let's put it in the Constitution. When you put something in the Constitution, it overturns any other law in the United States. So a constitutional amendment really completely and totally changes the whole country. With this new wave of feminism, there is a push for this amendment to be put in the Constitution. But it is very difficult to put an amendment in the Constitution. To get an amendment, you have to have, there's different ways to do it, but this is the most common way. 2/3 of both houses of Congress have to approve the amendment, and then 3/4 of the state legislatures have to approve the amendment as well. This means that you have to have like 66.6666% of Senate and the House of Representatives have to vote for it. And then 38 out of the 50 states have to vote for it as well. This is really difficult to do. As you can tell in politics today, Republicans and Democrats do not get along, and it's very rare for them to ever agree on anything with 2/3 of them agreeing at the same time. Okay, so for an amendment to pass, it typically has to make both sides happy. But the ERA was very popular in the late 1960s. There was strong public opinion approval. The women's movement was pushing for the amendment, and it actually passed through Congress by 1972. And the way it works is they get 10 years. After Congress passes it, you have 10 years to get the states to pass it. And 30 states passed it in the first year of the 10-year time. By 1973, they only need 8 more states to pass it. So it seems like the Equal Rights Amendment is going to be added to the Constitution. But it doesn't. Because as you know, this is not in our Constitution. So what group of people would want to stop the Equal Rights Amendment from happening? Now you might be thinking, men, but you're wrong. These are the states that ratified it. These are states that did not. The Stop ERA campaign stopped the Equal Rights Amendment, and they were led by a woman, Phyllis Schlafly. Okay, now Phyllis Schlafly spoke out about the dangers of tearing down the traditional roles of American women, and she said that the Equal Rights Amendment was basically an existential threat to the American family. Okay, before the feminist movement, and before you have this new way of thinking in the 1960s. It used to be that the basic unit of society was a family, okay? Like in the early days of American history, when we talk about the colonial era, the basic unit of society was the family, okay? And so a nation was not composed of individuals, but it was composed of families with a man at the head and the woman supporting the man and the children under the parents. As we move into the 1960s, the shift in American society has focused on individuals. Rather than a collection of families, our society is a collection of individuals, okay? With men and women acting as independent components of society rather than as a unified family unit. Phyllis Schlafly says that the ERA will basically ruin the whole family, okay? It'll ruin the family. It will destroy the fabric of American society. That families are the best way of organizing a society, okay? This sort of anti-ERA movement, the way they consider things to be is that families are what's best for kids, okay? If you look at a family with a broken home or divorced parents or abandonment, most kids that grow up in those homes would probably, desire to have their parents together. And when you look at statistics, having a family that is with married parents that are in a traditional marriage, that are taking care of their kids, those children tend to do better in life, okay? Now, I don't have all the numbers off the top of my head, but you can do the research on your own and see if that's true or not. But Phyllis Schlafly is going to argue very strongly that this is better for society, that changing the relationship between men and women and the relationship between the government and men and women is going to ruin the family. It's going to hurt children. It's going to lead to a worse society. She said that there were laws in America that intentionally discriminated, but for the good of women. Now let's look back here at a moment, okay? Equality of rights under the law shall not be abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That cuts both ways, men and women. So this amendment would make it illegal to have any law that treated women differently than men, but that means it also stops any laws that treat women better than men. So this would make women unable to be treated worse than men by the law, and they would not be allowed to be treated better than men by the law. So Phyllis Schlafly says there are protective laws in the United States regarding sexual assault. There are protective laws regarding favorable conditions for women in divorce cases that would be removed by the Equal Rights Amendment. And just to do a thought experiment, think about all the divorces that you know of and how many times the man retains custody of the children. Most of the time, the way our legal system is set up, divorces favor women. And this is to discourage men from leaving their families, okay? It tends to be a lot easier for a man to just abandon his family than it is for a woman. And so the laws make it harder on men to leave. This system might be removed by the Equal Rights Amendment. Other things like certain protections for victims of sexual assault that don't happen with other crimes might be taken away as well. There's all sorts of ways that the ERA, according to Phyllis Schlafly, might mess up the system. And she went even further. She said that women would start to be drafted. And her logic makes it make sense, okay? Only men get drafted to go fight in the Vietnam War, which is happening right when they're debating this. They're right at the end of the Vietnam War. So only men get to be drafted. But if this law gets passed, it would be unconstitutional. Women would have to be drafted and sent off to go fight in Vietnam as well. If a father can be separated from his children and sent to the jungles of Vietnam, why shouldn't a woman be separated from her children and be sent to the jungles in Vietnam? Now, if you're thinking to yourself, well, no, a mother shouldn't be separated from her children, then you're discriminating and you're being sexist, okay? And that's the argument right there. If you think that women should be treated differently than men in any way, then the ERA is going to take that away. That's Phyllis Schlafly's argument. She says, it sounds nice, but there will be unintended consequences of the law that would make life worse for women in America. She even went so far to say separate bathrooms by sex would become unconstitutional. You know, we used to have separate bathrooms off of race, that black people and white people couldn't go to the bathroom together until the 1964 Civil Rights Act got rid of that. So what Phyllis Schlafly says is that if there are no laws that treat men and women differently, then you couldn't have a separate men's bathroom and a women's bathroom. It'd just be the bathroom. So anyways, Phyllis Schlafly starts really campaigning against the Equal Rights Amendment, and she's very effective. She goes all across the country with her group, and they start campaigning, and they wear really traditional clothing. They wear these dresses and aprons, and they like bake pies and sew little doilies that say, stop the ERA, you know, like, oh, Senator, we baked you a pie. Please do not, give women equal rights to men, that sort of thing. Phyllis Schlafly was a really big troll. She loved to trigger feminists whenever she would start her speeches. She would often start off by saying, I would like to thank my husband for allowing me to speak to you today, which then would just, you shouldn't ask for permission, all that stuff. And she was really a troll. And she managed to win. Between 1973 and 1982, only 5 more states ratified the ERA. By 1982, the amendment expires 3 states short of passing. And by the 1980s, we have a resurgence in social conservatism. We've got Ronald Reagan as president, Republicans take power in Congress, and the Equal Rights Amendment just kind of fizzles away. And so there is no amendment to the Constitution outlawing gender discrimination. But the law is actually there. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlaws discrimination in a lot of ways based off of sex. So the laws still are there to outlaw discrimination. This failing does not mean that there's just discrimination by law. But an amendment is much more permanent than a law. You can get rid of a law by passing another law. You just got to get both houses of Congress to pass it and the president to sign it. In most cases. But an amendment is much more permanent. Here's Phyllis Schlafly wearing her little dress, stop the ERA. And they also, piled on to a lot of things. Conservatives started attacking, abortion. They attacked, Equal Rights Amendment. They attacked the feminist movement, all kind of lumped together. That this was all a larger effort to destroy the fabric of American society and to destroy the family. But the 1960s and 70s sees a lot of changes in American culture, okay? We are also start to see reform movements in all kinds of different areas. And we're going to go through the rest of these reform movements kind of quickly. We're just going to kind of breeze through them. But there's the environmentalist movement, which responded to the toll that the Industrial Revolution had taken on the environment. This is a consequence of technology, okay? As we build all these factories, we start to release a lot of pollution, okay? A lot of Americans wanted to change. Rachel Carson writes a book called The Silent Spring in 1962, where she explained the dangers of DDT, which was a pesticide that was killing birds across the country, including bald eagles. It was a pesticide that would be spread out on, plants to kill bugs, but then that poison would be eaten by fish or by birds, and those birds would be eaten by eagles, and then the poison would collect in birds of prey and weaken their eggs, and their eggs would be too fragile to, be healthy. And all of a sudden, bald eagles are going extinct. And that's our national bird. So all of a sudden, people are angry and outraged, and they work to ban DDT. They work to respond to changes in the environment. Lyndon Johnson is president when this happens. And like we talked about with the Great Society, a lot of his laws in the Great Society work to respond to problems in the environment, like the Wilderness Protection Act, the Water Quality Act, and the Air Quality Act. And I believe that right now, while I'm recording this, it is Earth Day, funnily enough. The first Earth Day was April 22nd, 1970. And whoa, look at this. What a coincidence. I am recording this on April 22nd, 2020, which is the 50th Earth Day. So this was exactly 50 years ago today. Cool stuff. Anyways, President Richard Nixon, a Republican president, was actually for protecting the environment. He signed legislation in 1970 that created the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, which is a government agency that kind of polices any pollution to reduce it. President Jimmy Carter tried to encourage renewable energy. And we also see a change in we had been doing a lot of atomic or nuclear energy, which on its face seems like a really good way of creating electricity. There's very little pollution with nuclear energy. It just lasts forever. You can make a lot of it. It's expensive to start up, but nuclear energy is a very productive way to make electricity. But the problem is if you have accidents on a nuclear power plant, it's not just like the place burns down. It's like you have, Chernobyl in Russia or Ukraine. And America had an incident very similar to Chernobyl, but it didn't get as bad, called 3 Mile Island, where the nuclear power plant almost had a meltdown. It wasn't as bad as the meltdown in Chernobyl and Ukraine, but it did scare a lot of people about the threat to the environment that nuclear energy possesses. Here's Rachel Carson and the Silent Spring. Here's an old advertisement for DDT. It was a very effective pesticide, and it led to a lot more food being able to be produced. But the downside is that it would filter its way through the bugs, through the fish, through the birds, and then to the eagles and kill them. Here's the EPA. Now, there's a lot more civil rights movements than just the African-American civil rights movement. We've got the Mexican-American civil rights movement, also known as the Chicano Movement. They had grown in population in the United States thanks to a lot of programs like the Bracero program, which had brought manual laborers to the U.S. from Mexico. But Mexican Americans faced a lot of discrimination in the United States. Typically, they were given very poor work conditions, and they were treated very poorly because a lot of them just simply did not have the same. Let's talk about migrant workers. Now, let me explain it this way. So for migrant workers, it's a lot harder to negotiate for better working conditions. What I was talking about is they don't have the same ability to negotiate as other workers do, okay? Migrant workers tend to move around the country from place to place to place wherever the jobs are, and they tend to be agricultural workers, okay? So in agriculture, there's periods of time where you need a lot of work, like when it's time to pick the apples. And then the rest of the year, you don't need that many workers because the trees are just growing. You just got to take care of them. So rather than hire lots and lots of farmers and keep them all year long, farms tend to use migrant labor, okay? And this still happens today, okay? There's a lot of migrant workers in the United States today where people move from place to place as jobs arise. So maybe they start off in 1 month, in like June, they're in Texas and they're picking onions. Then they move in July and they go to Arizona and they're picking, let's say they're, picking strawberries. Okay. Then they move to California in August and they pick grapes, and then they finish off the season in Washington, Washington State picking apples until September. And then they move back and they just circle around. Okay. And so migrant workers tend to move from place to place to place, and they're seen as disposable workers, okay? So they're paid very low wages, and there's typically a lot of workers. And so the business owners that own the farms, they can pay a very low wage, because if one migrant worker says, well, that's too much, that's too little work, I want better wages, then they'll say, fine, you just move on. I'll pick the next guy because the next guy in line is going to want the job. Migrant workers also, because they're moving around, they don't really get to have their children in school as easily. And because they're always moving around, they don't really have the same ability to set up a house and have an address. And you'd be surprised how difficult life is without an address. Think about all the forms that you fill out, all the things that you do. Getting an email, okay, getting an email, you have to have a physical address. Going to a store, signing up for a Brookshire's card or whatever. Everybody wants your address. And if you don't have it, try to get a driver's license without an address. How difficult that would be. How to go to school without an address. It's all very difficult. And so migrant workers tend to be treated really poorly, and they get very low wages, and they deal with very difficult conditions. And they're also discriminated against largely because they're Hispanic, okay? And there's just some plain old racism that leads to discrimination. So many migrant workers want to make things change. And so in 1965, there's a migrant worker leader named Cesar Chavez. He leads a strike protesting the poor treatment of migrant workers in California, and he organized something called the United Farm Workers Union, where the farm workers in California, they united together to try to get better wages and conditions. We've talked about labor unions before. And they operate a lot like a labor union, and they hold a national boycott of grapes. They try to encourage everyone across the country to stop buying grapes until the grape farmers start treating their workers better. Now, who does this remind you of? What civil rights leader also had peaceful protests, led boycotts, and got people together to protest in a united front? I'm thinking Martin Luther King Jr., okay? Cesar Chavez is kind of like a Martin Luther King Jr. for the Hispanic civil rights movement, and he's an inspiring figure even today. There's a lot of places in the United States that have Cesar Chavez roads. There's schools named after him. He is a hero to many Mexican Americans and Hispanic Americans because of the hard work that he did to try to change the way that Hispanic people were treated in the country. And the 1964 Civil Rights Act also eliminates or outlaws discrimination based off of race, and that includes discriminating against people because they're Hispanic. So there are laws to protect Hispanic Americans from discrimination in the United States. And if someone violates those laws, they need to be, dealt with. And you go through the process of the law, you either sue them or you report them to the authorities, and then the wheels start turning from there. But for some people, that wasn't enough. For some people, they didn't like the law. They didn't think that the law was doing a good enough job, that people weren't following it, and they were upset with de facto discrimination against Hispanic Americans. Groups like the Brown Berets, who strove to control Chicano neighborhoods and battled the immigration and naturalization services in the United States. They chanted things like Brown Power. Now, who does that remind you of? It kind of reminds me of Malcolm X, the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers. And in fact, there is that wing of the Hispanic civil rights movement that's more militant, like the Black nationalist movement. There's also the Red Power movement, which emerges at the same time in Native American communities and ghettos across the Midwest. Like we talked about before when we talked about the wars with Native Americans, after the conclusion of Native American wars in the West, Native Americans were put on reservations. And guess what? In the 1960s, they're still there. Their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren are living and still feeling the effects of the wars for the West that happened in the late 1800s, okay? And the way that America's reservation policies worked contributed to a lot of poverty in America. The American Indian movement said that U.S. policies perpetuated Native American poverty. Essentially, what happens is this, and there's a lot more details to it, but Native Americans are provided services and resources by the U.S. government if they stay on the reservation. Okay, so if you stay on the reservation, the land that is reserved for Native Americans, there's basic necessities. Okay, so the government gives them enough to have basic shelter, food, clothing, that sort of thing, but not a lot extra. Okay, if you want to have a better life than the bare minimum, you've got to go and get a job somewhere and leave the reservation. But that is a risk that's very scary, okay? Imagine, do you want to stay in the reservation and be guaranteed to have your basic needs met? Or do you want to leave the reservation and lose all those benefits and have to risk it and live and work on your own. For many Native Americans, they choose to stay with what is stable and what is there. Okay. And for many of them, there aren't any opportunities to leave anyways. Okay. There's not a lot of economic opportunity. There's not a lot of factories. There's not a lot of universities. There's not a lot of ways for Native Americans to advance on the reservation. For a young Native American who wants to, make a difference in the world, if they want to get a degree and go get a nice job somewhere, they're going to have to leave the reservation, and they lose those benefits, and they leave their families behind, all that sort of stuff. It's a mess. And so what this has led to is a very, very bad situation. It's like an endless cycle of poverty. Today in America, Native Americans deal with the cycles of poverty as they're kept on reservations and they're just stuck. Okay, Native American reservations have high rates of suicide, depression, and all sorts of problems with substance abuse. And it largely stems back to the policies that the United States instituted that basically keeps Native Americans in prisons of the reservations. And we're still dealing with those problems today. In the 1960s, Native Americans protested this through many different movements. At certain points, Native American reservations, they would shut down the roads that drove through them. A lot of Native American reservations have highways that go through them, and you see a lot of Native American groups shut down the highways, put up roadblocks, and protest the U.S. policies. For example, Native Americans occupied Wounded Knee in South Dakota, the same location where that last massacre, the Wounded Knee Massacre, happened to end the Native American Wars for 71 days in 1973. Back in 1969, Native Americans seized the island of Alcatraz, which had long before it was ever even a prison, it had belonged to Native Americans who had been swindled out of it by white Americans. And so they go back and they try to, occupy the island for 18 months. So there's a lot of protest movements in the United States that are going against the U.S. government. You also see the LGBT rights first big push of their movement in the 1960s with the Stonewall Rights of 1969. Here's a flyer for the Bracero program. Here's Cesar Chavez leading a strike. We have the Chicano movement, which is, a lot like the Black Pride movement, like Black is beautiful. The Chicano movement is sort of being proud of who you are and not, being relegated to, what society thinks you are. And Chicano is a very specific sort of group in America. Hispanic refers to just anyone with Latin American descent in America. Hispanic American. Chicano specifically refers to people that are of Mexican descent, but they're also of United States descent. It's that blending of cultures between the United States and Mexico that occurs along the border. And so Chicano is a very specific group of people. And the Chicano movement is really pushing for Chicano pride, okay? Here's the Red Power movement, the American Indian movement, protesters occupying Wounded Knee. And there's also just plain old protesters, okay? There's protesters for all sorts of things. There's protests for civil rights movements, and there's protesters against the Vietnam War in the 1960s. Remember, a lot of things happened in the 60s. We've got things stacked on top of each other. We got the Cold War. We've got the feminist movement. We got the African-American civil rights movement, the Hispanic civil rights movement. We got the Vietnam War happening at the same time. All these things, the Great Society, lots of stuff is happening in the 1960s. So you kind of have to keep this all in mind. But during the 1960s, the baby boomers, that generation of people that was born after World War II, they're now in college. And when they go to college, they bring that new culture that they have with them to campus, and you start to see many of these young college students questioning the society that their parents built. And that's kind of normal. When you're in college, you start questioning everything. You change your hair color, or you cut your hair, and you start talking weird. And you go home at Thanksgiving, and your parents are like, why are you talking so fancy? Okay. And, when you're in college, you start, thinking out new ideas, and you're exposed to all these new things. And also, when you're in college, you don't have a lot of ties to, say, a family or a job or a house that keeps you grounded. And so it's really easy for college students to just be carried away by whatever social movement there is. And you'll notice that throughout history, The people that are always joining these new movements that are going to change the world are usually college kids, because, you know, they're open to that idea. The world is new and they're new, and they can make changes much more easily than someone who's, say, 50 years old, has 3 kids, they've got a house and a mortgage, and they've got a job. They can't go out and protest. They got to go to work. So college students, they tend to be your protesters. Students for a Democratic Society formed in June 1962, and they condemned middle-class materialism, racism, conformity, and anti-communism. They created a counterculture, which is a subculture that opposes the cultural norms of the time. And the way that countercultures work is they go against the grain. So everybody else is going this way, the counterculture goes the other way. So you can't tell me what to do, Dad. I'm going to wear my pants whatever way I want to. You know, I'm going to grow my hair out. I'm going to stop bathing, that sort of thing. You can't tell me what to do, old man. And the countercultures, typically what happens is they bring new ideas. So the main culture is going this way, the counterculture is going that way, and the main culture kind of pays attention to the counterculture. They take the things they like, and then they leave the rest behind. So the countercultures tend to change the main culture over time. For example, we'll talk about this with hippies. Hippies have a lot of crazy ideas, and the rest of the U.S. culture kind of ignores them, but we like their music, and so we take their music and we make it mainstream. Okay, so the dominant culture typically takes the neat things from countercultures and mainstreams it, you know, the fashion, the music, and they leave behind, like, you know, the rampant drug abuse and the living in communes and that sort of thing. The counterculture opposed what they perceived to be a military-industrial complex that controlled the country. Remember, we're right in the middle of the Vietnam War, and so many people think that the government is under the control of big military corporations. They're just trying to make money by selling guns and tanks and airplanes and ammo to the government. And so, you know, the man is out to get you. And the man wants you to shut up and go to work and do your job and go to Vietnam and die. Don't listen to the man, man. Be your own person, man. That's the idea behind the student activism. They lead the anti-war movement, all those protests about the Vietnam War that we talked about in the Vietnam War video. College students are right there at the lead of this, and they oppose the U.S. actions in the Cold War. The New Left starts to fragment towards the end of the 1960s. They're not really all organized in one group. They're kind of just scattered people throughout the country that oppose it, with some of them being fairly normal, because there's a lot of normal people that oppose the Vietnam War. They say, you know what, this is a waste of time, this is a waste of money, it's killing a lot of people, let's get out. And then there's some more extreme people like the weathermen who start blowing places up, okay? So try to not be the extreme people. Try to stay on the more, you know, normal side. There's a change going to come, peace demonstrators, bring our boys home, that sort of thing. But probably the most famous group of people from the 1960s is the hippies, okay? It's what we've been waiting for, the hippies. You know, when you think about the 1960s, a lot of times when people say, think about the 1960s, they think about the hippies, which is kind of weird because they don't really show up till the late part of the 1960s. The early part of the 1960s was a fairly conservative time. You think about like John F. Kennedy being president, the early civil rights movement. Think about like the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, okay? The early 60s are a lot more conservative than the late 60s. But by the late 60s, there's a wave of counterculture that very radically wants to change American society. They question everything, not just things like the Vietnam War, but the very basic parts of living in an American society get questioned by the hippies, okay? Make love, not war. Don't trust anyone over 30. The hippies is a counterculture of baby boomers who oppose the culture created by their parents. Have you ever thought about how your parents are lame? You've probably thought about it. You've been like, oh man, mom and dad, they're so lame. They're so boring. They don't understand the world the way I do. They're so old in their way of thinking. Well, guess what? You're not the first one to think that. Your parents thought that about your grandparents. Your grandparents thought that about your great-grandparents, and all the way back to Noah's Ark and that sort of thing, okay? You know, Cain and Abel probably thought Adam and Eve were dumb, okay, because they were their parents. Who knows? All right, maybe not. But anyway, maybe they were good kids, okay? Well, Cain wasn't. But anyways, hippies do the same thing that all teenagers do. They question their parents, and they question everything. Not just the Vietnam War, not just politics, but how to live in society, how to dress, how to act, okay? Traditional American society says men should be tough and manly, wear their hair short and, be tough. Hippie men like to wear their hair long, wear flowers, flower power, man, peace, man, not war, man. Traditional America says the Vietnam War and fighting communism is good. We needed to protect the democratic capitalist way of life that we have. The hippies say, no, man, let's not make war. Let's just be peace, man. Why are you working all the time, man? Why don't you just enjoy life, man? You see, the modern American culture says you should get married, you should go to college, you should get a job, you should work hard at your job and take care of your kids. The hippies say, don't work, man. Just relax, man. Here, have some of this, man. Let's have some free love, man. Okay? Instead of getting married and having a regular job, a lot of hippies reject marriage. They just have free and open love with whoever they want to, whenever they want to. They don't really get normal jobs. They don't really do the things that normal Americans do. And this movement becomes symbolic of the youth in the 1960s. They have new attitudes about drugs. They have new attitudes about sex. They have new attitudes about communal lifestyles, food, fashion, and music. Thanks to birth control, there is a much more ability to reject traditional sexuality, and they become much more casual about it. This idea of free love is literally free love, okay? Not possessing people, not having relationships, but just being with whoever and whenever, okay? A lot of hippies live in these things called communes. They try to make these utopian societies where they try to create a perfect world. And large groups of hippies just kind of live together and share everything. Literally everything, okay? They experiment with drugs, okay? A lot of marijuana, a lot of LSD, mushrooms, pills, a lot of psychedelic colors and images they experiment with, okay? And that's why you see tie-dye everywhere. That's why you see, the hippie psychedelic, all the colors and stuff. That's trying to replicate the sort of fantasies and things that people see when they hallucinate when they're on those drugs. Now, what this leads to is some unintentional consequences, like venereal diseases, STDs, drug addictions, mental disorders, and other problems, okay? Because you don't want to go on a bad trip, man. A good trip might be good, but a bad trip might, kill you. Or at least make you think, that you're on fire and you jump off something, okay? Which actually happened. There's all sorts of stories we talk about the hippies about, a lady, thinking that she can fly because she's on, LSD or whatever, and she jumps out a window, falls to her death. There's all sorts of crazy stuff you can talk about. But a lot of hippies experimented with drugs. They experimented with these new ideas about life, about sex, about communes. They start wearing their hair long. Flowers are a big part of their deal. They're all about peace, man. But there's also other, iconic fashion items of the hippies like bell-bottom jeans, tie-dye. A lot of hippies become vegetarians. Don't eat the animals, man. They have a spirit, man, that sort of thing. A lot of hippies reject traditional Christianity, which is, kind of the mainstream in America. And they turn to more Eastern religions like Buddhism, and Hinduism, things like that from Asia. They start to adopt a lot of those ideas into their way of thinking. And they literally just reject everything that their parents put together, okay? A lot of focus is on the health of your mind, body, and spirit, man. You got to get your chakras aligned, use these crystals, things like that. And a lot of these, offshoot ideas of the hippies still linger around today. There's still a lot of people that are running around with crystals trying to, align their chakras and, fix their problems that way. But the communes don't really last that long. And that's because it's kind of hard to live in a commune, okay? People form attachments. You want your boyfriend or your girlfriend to be your boyfriend and your girlfriend. You don't want to share them. When you go and when you decide that, you know what, hey guys, we need to eat. Someone's got to go outside and work and bring some food back to the commune. So you go and you do your hippie duty and you go out to get a job and you bring your paycheck back, and then you go back to the commune and your friend's like, awesome, man, share the love, man. And you've got this paycheck that you worked hard for. You don't want to share it with them. Like, I worked for this. I want to buy food for myself. But man, we share everything, man. It's a commune, man. No, this is mine. And so communes tend to fizzle out. There's around 2,000 communes throughout the 1960s, but there's nowhere near that many left today. Probably the most enduring contribution of the hippies is rock music and the effect that they had on rock music, especially when you start taking drugs. Okay, one of the offshoots of drugs is different music. Okay, and there's a lot of famous bands that come out of the hippie movement or popular with the hippie movement, like the Doors. The Beatles are a good example. You want to see something interesting, what happens when you take drugs, kids? Here's what you can see to see what happens when you do drugs. Go watch the Beatles sing I Want to Hold Your Hand on the Ed Sullivan Show. And then just a few years later, listen to their song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. That's what drugs do, okay? Just go, that's your homework. Go watch those videos and tell me if you watch them in the comments. Okay, now, just tell me, what does drugs do? See how Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds compares to I Want to Hold Your Hand. Same guys, same band. What's the difference? What happened? Okay. Here's Woodstock. This was a big, massive music festival in 1969 where you have just thousands and thousands of hippies descend upon this huge music festival. It was very, musically successful, but it was also a big, huge mess. Here's some hippies, riding together, sharing everything, man. Hippie colors. Here's the Beatles and their more psychedelic album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. We don't have a saying in this movement that we don't trust anybody over 30. But here's the thing. Hippies were less than 10% of the population. Most people in America were not hippies. In fact, the vast majority of Americans were not hippies, and they didn't even like hippies. Or, they didn't want to be hippies, okay? Most young people, most young Americans didn't become hippies. Most young college students didn't become hippies. Most of these young people were normal. They sought out normal careers and normal lifestyles. You're always going to have a few people that are weird or different or want to do different things, but most people tend to be normal, okay? In fact, if you look at the numbers, young and educated people tended to support the Vietnam War more than older people who were not educated. And when we talk about educated, that means like college education. So why do we remember the hippies as the dominant force of the 60s? We've talked about so many things in the 60s, the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, the Great Society, all these different things. But when I say 1960s, people think hippies. Even though all this rest of the stuff happened, why do we think about hippies? If you have a different idea about why we think about hippies for the 1960s, please let me know in the comments today. But my opinion is this. The outrageous lifestyle of the hippies made their presence in the media exaggerated. You notice the different people more than the normal people, okay? That's why we're so good at finding where's Waldo, and humans are good at that. We're good at figuring out what sticks out. You ever seen those little pictures where it's like 50, rabbits and there's one squirrel in picture? It's like spot the different one. We're good at finding the different, and those ones stick out, okay? When something is different, we notice it. And because hippies are so different, they get a lot of attention. And they get a lot of attention, and the normal people don't get as much attention. So is that good history? Is it good for us as historians to focus on the weird people? Or should we spend more time on what everyone else does? If I had done this lecture differently, I could have spent 90% of it talking about normal, regular Americans who went out and got normal, boring jobs and lived normal, boring lives. And only spend 10%, so let's say this video is an hour long, that would mean that I would take 54 minutes to talk about normal people and only spend 6 minutes on hippies. But that wouldn't be very fun because hippies are just so weird. We got to talk about it. So, is that good history? Let me know. What should we do? Should we, as historians, focus as much on hippies? Let me know in the comments. Or should we not focus on hippies? And should we focus on normal people instead? What happens to the hippies? Well, they grow up. Eventually, the counterculture members become folded into the greater culture. Eventually, you got to eat. Living on love doesn't put food on the table. You got to go get a job. You got to go get a normal life. And you're probably going to end up, marrying your, hippie girlfriend or your hippie boyfriend and having a regular-ish life. But you might keep your long hair. You might keep your rock music. You might keep your more casual attitudes about sex. But you're probably not going to be doing LSD all the time when you're 60 years old. As you get older, you're going to move away from the communes and the utopias and the drugs. But you're going to still listen to The Doors. You're still going to listen to Bob Dylan. Okay? And that's what happens to the hippies. The hippies basically become normal people, but we still listen to their music. That counterculture gets folded into the main culture, and we still remember them that way today. And, whenever we have a spirit day at the high school where it says dress up like the 1960s, everyone dresses up like a hippie, even though most people were probably just dressed normally. So anyways, with that, we come to the end of the 1960s. Let me know your thoughts below about our little discussion about the hippies or about anything. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, please let me know. I'm just a phone call or an email away, and I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. Lord willing, it'll be real easy, real simple. We'll get through this. Make sure you're working on studying for your last exam. I sent out the review. Make sure you're finishing up your final paper. Okay. The next couple videos about the 1970s and the 1980s and the 1990s, there's about 3 more videos after this. Those ones are videos that I have already recorded for the U.S. history class, except for the 90s one. I'm going to have to record that later today, hopefully. So you can just start watching through them and you can finish the lectures for the rest of the year. So if you want to finish your test early and send it in to me, you can go ahead and get ready for the test and, have everything ready. And then when I give you the test, you can finish it real quick. If you want to turn in your term paper early, you can go ahead and send it in and get things done. Since we're doing this more flexibly, the earlier you get it done is probably the better. It means, an earlier break for you. Anyways, thank you for your time and your attention. I appreciate you all, and I miss you all, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you.